Here at Working Families, we wanted to answer a question today. That question is, what can I do if someone in my household is vulnerable or shielding? Because everyone's situation is different and new issues are arising all the time, this video won't tell you categorically whether your employer is asking you to do something illegal. But it will give you some pointers on how to approach a conversation with your employer, or whether you actually need to contact an employment lawyer or advisor. Remember, the rights we're discussing today are for workers, employees, or those on payroll. So if you're self-employed, the situation can often be different. You might want to seek other advice. In another video, we looked at your rights when you cannot continue working because you care for someone, your child or someone else in the family who depends on you. Slightly different question here though. You live with someone who is vulnerable and is shielding, avoiding all face-to-face contact, but your workplace has not shut down and your employer needs you at the place of work. But you don't want to bring the virus home. So can you stay away? Will you be paid? Shielding means staying at home at all times to avoid face-to-face contact. This is for anyone displaying the coronavirus symptoms and also for those who've been deemed clinically extremely vulnerable. See the link below for who falls into this category. If you're in this situation, you should have received a letter telling you that you need to shield, or you've probably been told by your GP. If you're not extremely vulnerable yourself, but you live with someone who is, the government recommends taking extra precautions, but unfortunately this means you're not entitled automatically to statutory sick pay. It's also important to note that even for vulnerable individuals, the countrywide guidance on shielding is due to change on the 1st of August. This means that the government will pause shielding unless the transmission of COVID-19 in the community starts to rise again significantly. It might also be the case that shielding guidance changes and is issued locally moving forward, so it's important to stay updated with what's happening in your area. Now we'll discuss furlough, or otherwise known as the Coronavirus Retention Scheme. Previous government guidance made it clear that furlough was available to those unable to come to work because of caring responsibilities, and also for those shielding and those living with someone who is shielding. However, as people start to go back to work, the government has also changed the way that furlough works. So if you were not placed on furlough on or before the 10th of June, you'll actually no longer be entitled to the standard furlough. Although there are some exceptions to this for those who've been taking some kind of parental leave, like maternity leave, for instance. With the end of the furlough scheme, we'll see the introduction of a new scheme, flexible furlough. This will allow your employer to furlough you during some of your hours, whilst also allowing you to work part-time. Whilst this might still mean going into work, it at least gives you the opportunity to minimise the contact hours in the workplace and reduce the risk for your dependent at home. It's worth noting that furlough is not a statutory right, therefore your employer doesn't have to. Both of you and your employer have to agree to furlough. On another note, the government discourages public sector employees from using the scheme, but this doesn't mean and shouldn't mean you can't ask to be furloughed if it's necessary for you. There's a link to the government's guidance on how furlough and flexible furlough works below in this video, and it might be worth you having a conversation with your employer about flexible furlough, as it's less well known. If you're not eligible for furlough, or your employer is unwilling to furlough you, there are some other options available to you. I'll discuss these now. The first one is working from home. If you live with someone who's shielding and it's possible for you to work from home, then really you should. And when your employer is deciding whether or not to allow you to work from home, what they shouldn't be taking into account is whether or not you working from home is going to impact the business, as it might be for a flexible working request, for instance. However, if you have already been working from home successfully, then it might be worth drawing your employer's attention to this. It could be that this makes the change for them to decide. If your employer refuses, you could argue that it would be a breach of your employment contract to refuse this. More specifically, a breach of the mutual duty of trust and confidence to force you to continue to come to work. You could use this argument to negotiate the allowance of another kind of leave with your employer, and this might be effective. Time off for dependents. If the extremely vulnerable person depends on you for their care, you have the right to something called time off for dependents. This leave ordinarily lasts for a couple of days, But it's our opinion at Working Families that during the COVID-19 crisis, it should last for the amount of time that your dependent has actually been told to shield by the public health official guidance or by their letter. There should be no need to negotiate here. If the time off is reasonable and necessary, your employer cannot actually refuse it legally, and you have a right not to be punished for taking that time off. Time off for dependents, though, is only available to employees and not workers, and unless your contract or company policy says otherwise, it's unpaid. We'll explain a little bit more about this in another video. Unpaid parental leave. Unpaid parental leave is available to you if your child is under 18 years old. You're entitled to parental leave if you're an employee who has worked for the employer for at least 1 year. And as a rough guide, you can take 4 weeks per year per child. Your employer might be able to postpone this, however, if the business would be disrupted by you taking the leave. Whereas for time off for dependents, this isn't possible. So that might be the better option for you. Strictly speaking, you do need to give notice for unpaid parental leave. But given the circumstances, it might be that your employer is willing to let you take the leave without giving the required amount of notice. Some employers actually offer paid parental leave. So it's worth checking your employment contract or your policy to see if that's an option. This leave generally has to be taken in blocks of 1 week. However, if your child is receiving DLA, Disability Living Allowance, or PIP, Personal Independence Payment, you can take parental leave in blocks of 1 day instead, which might be more useful to you. Special leave. Special leave is leave that your employer has agreed to specifically because of the coronavirus crisis, or in fact, as part of a more general compassionate leave policy that some employers might have. It could be worth having a discussion with your employer to see if they are willing to allow this or make some exceptions for special leave on your behalf, given your difficulties with the person shielding at home. Annual leave. One that most people are familiar with is annual leave, but you can actually use this for the coronavirus crisis to help the person at home that's shielding. Annual leave could be really useful in the scenario where the person at home that's shielding does not actually depend on you for care, because in these instances, it's more difficult to negotiate time off for dependents. So to offer a summary, if someone in your house is shielding and you want to avoid going into work to protect them, there are a few options that are available to you. The first one is that you could work from home. This might be the most financially viable one, as it means you can continue to be paid. Secondly, you can ask to be furloughed. As we mentioned before, there are some restrictions on this now, but it might be worth having a discussion with your employer about flexible furlough, and this way you at least get paid partially. Finally, you could use one of the other methods to ask for some time off. Unfortunately, it's unlikely that this method would be paid, but it at least allows you to shield and help your dependent shield effectively. We've put some links below to our website where you can find more information about any of the topics that we've discussed in this video or any of the other videos.